But Jesus says it this way to make his listeners stop and think. Now let's just look at a few examples. I'm going to go to another gospel now. This is Luke's gospel, and I'm going to read to you from chapter 18. Luke's gospel, chapter 18. And this is very interesting because first it starts with a parable, a story of Jesus. And then we have a situation in which Jesus deals with something. And then another little story. And each one of these illustrates the exact same point. Now in verse 9, Luke's gospel, chapter 18, 18, verse 9. It says he spoke a parable. Now a parable just means a story. It really means a story with a moral point. A parable just means a made-up story with a moral point, to make a point. So this isn't a true story about true people. This is a made-up story. Jesus made up this story and made up these characters to make a moral point. Verse 9. He spoke this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. Those two things go hand in hand. Just as I was talking about before, you know what I said to you, unless you're perfectly righteous, you don't have a chance with a perfectly righteous God. That doesn't stop people from having a kind of a self-righteous attitude. And he calls this trusting in themselves that they're righteous. And it's not just 2,000 years ago with the Pharisees. It's still around today. You know, that's generally what people think, the way people like to think about things. I may not be perfect, but at least I'm better than this bunch of people over here. As long as I can find somebody worse than me, then I don't feel quite so bad. But what that means is I'm now trusting in myself that I am righteous. Now Jesus said, blessed are those who are spiritually poor. If I think that I'm pretty good, I don't think I'm spiritually poor. Does that make sense? If I think I'm righteous, if I think I'm better than somebody else, then I'm taking pride in myself and looking down at others. That's what he says here. He's speaking this story towards a person with that kind of an attitude. Then he says in verse 10, 2 men went to the temple to pray. So he's going to illustrate the point by these two made-up individuals. 2 men went to the temple to pray. The one a Pharisee, the other a publican. Now, let me stop and explain these words. A Pharisee, there were in the Jewish world of which Jesus was living, there were different categories of people, different kind of belief systems within Judaism. And the Pharisees were the people who prided themselves on being the strictest observers of the law of Moses and the rules. They took pride in themselves and their holy lives. And they are the ones who looked down at everybody else and they thought, we are really something. We are really righteous. And everybody else thought the same thing about them. They were considered to be the most holy, the most righteous people around. They were generally regarded that way. As far as outward appearance, they seemed that way. So he went to the temple to pray, and the other is a publican. Not a Republican. They didn't have those then. A publican, which means a tax collector. The publican, they were tax collectors, and they worked for the Roman government. And the Romans told them, generally speaking, in a nutshell, you raise the taxes that we require, and we'll back you up with the force of arms, and you extract the taxes that we require, and then you can take whatever you want for yourself by extortion. And so everyone hated them. And they lived, they were notorious. If the Pharisees were looked at as the most holy people around, the publicans were regarded as the worst people around, the most wretched, And they tended to exploit their money and have wild parties and extravagant things, and were not really known necessarily for their clean and upstanding lifestyle. They were looked down upon, probably the worst kind of person around. So here we have the best, as far as people think, and the worst. And so they'd gone to the temple to pray. And so the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, in verse 11. God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. In other words, in case you don't understand what I mean, like him, for instance. That's how he's praying. Oh, I thank you that I'm not like everybody else. And then he names off these things, extortioners. See, why does he say extortioners? Because that's what they regarded these tax collectors as. I was about to say, you might have the same idea about tax collectors today. Okay. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers. That's what they were known for. Even as this publican. See, he's pointing out to God, him right over here. And now that's how I'm not doing bad things. Then he begins to tell all the good things. I fast twice in the week. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. I give tithes of all that I possess. Nothing wrong with that either. But see, what the Pharisee is doing that's wrong is he's trusting in himself, in his own righteousness. That's what Jesus is telling the story for. He's boasting about all that he's done. The publican, verse 13, standing afar off, would not even lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Now when he says, God be merciful to me, a sinner, does it sound to you like he regards himself as spiritually bankrupt? Yeah, that's how he regards himself. He doesn't have anything to boast about. And probably, legitimately so. He probably didn't have anything to boast about. And you would think, just from outward, even if we were standing there observing this, just as people, we would still kind of give the commendation to the Pharisee. Well, at least look at the good things he's done. Maybe he's perfect. Maybe he's a little proud. But at least he's doing some good things. While as this guy, yeah, he is a sinner. We would agree with him. But see, he says, listen, all he says to God, all he's got to say, he's got nothing to commend himself. He's got nothing to boast about. He's got nothing to say, I'm trying to do my best. He's got nothing to say in his own defense at all. He only says, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. He gives a commendation to the man who had nothing going for him spiritually. The man who said, God be merciful to me, a sinner. He commends him. He said, now not only that, he said, this man went down to his house justified. Now we read over that and don't really think about it. The word justified means in right alignment. It means right in the eyes of God. How can that be? How can the man who's a sinner be right in the eyes of God? Hold your finger right there. Or just hold your... I'll have Anton give me this. In Romans chapter 4, Paul brings up this very same point, and here's what he says. He's talking about Abraham, and listen to this. Anton, give me Romans chapter 4, verse 5. Oh, go back to verse 4. How about that? He says, now to him that worketh, the reward is not reckoned of grace, but of debt. In other words, he says, if you work, if you do everything right, if you've got something that you can look at and say, these are my works, then you deserve payment. When you work, you get paid, but you don't call that a gift. But what God wants to dispense to us is a free gift. Grace. He wants to give us grace. But if you think you've earned it, then it's not grace anymore. Then it's a reward. But look at the next verse. Yeah. Now to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. But to him that worketh not. He doesn't mean that we don't do anything, but we don't have any works to boast about. That's what he means by that. To him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly. Did you read that? That justifieth the ungodly. His faith is counted for righteousness. Now that's what that publican who said, God be merciful to me, a sinner, and Jesus said, this man went down to his house justified. Because God can justify the ungodly. He can make them right in His sight because of their dependence on Him and on Jesus. God, him that believeth on Him, that justifies the ungodly. See, that's an amazing thought right there. That He can see, we think the godly need to straighten up, the ungodly need to straighten up and fly right. That's going to justify them. And agreed that after, as a Christian, being justified by faith, that we do experience a change in our life. When you change your mind, when you think differently, a change of action is sure to follow. And we're going to see that here in a moment too. Okay, now go back to Luke's Gospel, chapter 18. But we can't trust in ourselves. Remember what Jesus said, blessed are those who are spiritually bankrupt. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So this man, verse 14, went down to his house justified. This is Luke 18:14. Rather than the other. For everyone that exalts himself shall be abased, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. Okay, I think we got the point of that story. Look at the next thing that happens. This is very interesting that these things happen one right after the other. They brought unto him also infants. You know what an infant is. A little baby. Maybe not just newborn, a day old, but, in that category before they're toddlers. A small infant that you have to carry around in your arms. They brought unto him infants, that he would touch them. In other words, they wanted him to bless these children, these babies. And when his disciples saw it, they rebuked them. In other words, what the disciples are saying, look, Jesus got better things to do than, this is not a babysitting service here. He's got better things to do than me touching these children.